Hey guys, welcome back to the Buff Nerd Podcast. I have a very special guest with me today, Dr. Einat Metzl. She's a doctor of art therapy, a professor at LMU, and a marriage and family therapist. So, hey, how you doing?
Hi. Very, very good to be here. Thank you.
I'm very glad to have you. I I'm really excited for this episode because I've talked to you a bunch, and I always feel like there's way more to learn. You've had a very interesting life. Um, So I'm just gonna just pelt you with questions all about your life.
Sounds perfect.
First and foremost, where'd you grow up?
So I was born in Israel and I grew up in a kibbutz, which is a social commune.
Hmm.
They still exist all over Israel, but they are now profoundly changed. At the time that I grew up there, however, I didn't grow up with my parents, so I would visit my parents' house in the afternoons. But most of the day and at night, we slept in what we call the Children's Society, in small housing, basically of children of around the same age. So I was with 13 kids around the same
Hmm.
age, and we literally just lived together. It was amazing. We had a wonderful time. It was probably not as supervised as you would want,
Yeah,
but otherwise, it was a wonderful experience for me at the time.
yeah. And how long did you live there?
I lived there until I was 13. When I was 13, my parents left the kibbutz. People can grow actually and live in the kibbutz and stay in the kibbutz, and there are many people that still do. So there's no time
So were you with the
expiration.
same group of kids the entire time?
Yes,
Oh,
until I was 13.
must have formed some strong bonds there. I
It
imagine.
did, and it's a very different kind of
Hmm.
family, and it's a different understanding of family as a community. The whole idea of the Israeli kibbutz system, as in other communes, I was really interested in utopias at some point in my life. Japan actually has a similar commune system called the
Hmm.
Yamagishi Kai, but it has a very different ideology. Um, anyway, in Israel, the whole idea is that you're creating a children's society as a society, right? And you're trying to pour a lot of resources and you're trying to develop the future that you would want to see through the kids that you have. Now, of course, there's also other aspects to that, right? So it's a very, in some ways, it's a very privileged, very sheltered life.
Hmm.
Um, and then on the other hand, we were exposed to politics at a very early age. We had a lot of experiences, very, very independent living in many ways. Um, for the majority of people, it wasn't a wonderful experience, I will say. However, you will also hear stories of people who didn't really like that or really wanted to stay with their parents and couldn't.
Yeah.
And with years and with the impact of capitalism, actually, the kibbutzes have changed completely. And so now they do exist, but kids actually stay with the parents in the parents' home. Some of that shift happened around the time that I was 13. And I remember the kids all went protesting because we really wanted it to stay the same, but we lost
Yeah.
because the parents wanted it differently. But my parents at that time decided to leave and move to a nearby town anyway. So that was a very big shock because
Yeah.
here I was, I grew up in a community, I don't know, maybe 300 people community that I knew everyone. Everybody knew me and they knew my backstory. Um, and essentially, you're very protected because even if you do something really, really stupid, somebody's going to see you and they're going to tell your parents,
Hmm.
right? Or your teacher. And so we did some silly things, but you also have the community kind of hold you. It's more similar to, I guess, rural communities around the world, where what we call the less developed world, in some ways, developed, much more developed in a different way, I think.
Hmm.
Um, and when I moved to a city, I suddenly was thrusted into the kind of life that we have here, where you have very urban living and you have, I don't know, classes of 40 something kids in a classroom that really don't know each other and come from very different experiences. Um, I remember I was asked for the first time what my background was, because in Israel, as in here, there's a lot of prejudice and different kind of racism. But there's like a question of how do you see yourself, how do you affiliate yourself ethnically? And I really didn't know how to answer that question because I've never been asked that before in the kibbutz. It was not on my radar at all.
Yeah.
And so just that juxtaposition is incredible when you move from one place to the next.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did you adjust to that new life in the city?
Slowly. I mean, this is the truth about, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But
Hmm.
one of my interests in general, scholarly, but also just as a person, is in resilience and how do we all manage and recover, bounce back, if you will, from moments that are very difficult or risky for us. And we all do that. We all do that
Hmm.
a lot. And sometimes we don't pay attention, but if you take stock at your life, you'll find that you've done that many, many times. And you can typically remember if you try to go back those times where you really had to actively adjust to
Yeah.
something. Yeah.
So when you were having those hard times as a 13, 14-year-old in a
Mm.
new city, what kinds of activities did you do to deal
Mm.
with it?
It's a good question. I mean, I've always loved art,
Hmm.
which is partly why I'm an art therapist, I think. But I also came from a household that was very art heavy. My dad's an artist,
Hmm.
and also an organizational consultant by trade, but he really is an artist. And my mom, my biological mom, was a dancer, so there was a lot of influences towards that direction. I was always really interested in writing. Poetry was a big thing for me growing up, and friends. I spent a lot of time outside of the house. Um, I love music. I love dance. But I think still, even with all these things sort of around me and available to me and very consciously available to me, it was a big loss. And that's one of the differences you'll see between when we talk about the concept of resilience versus hardiness, is that you'll see a dip in people's ability to function or to do what they want or to feel good about life, but then they're able to bounce back. So it's not like you're not impacted,
Hmm.
but you're able to be impacted and then sort of pull your resources and bring yourself back up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm sure you will be able to relate how all of that is affecting you now, or how it's made you as a
Sure.
person today. But I want to talk a little bit more about your path from there. So you moved to the city at the age of
Hmm.
13. Do you finish up school there?
I did. So in the kibbutz, they didn't have enough kids for all the classes. So they decided, it was kind of a strange way they did that, but they kind of decided if you were ready academically, that you skipped a class. So I
Hmm.
skipped the second grade, which really meant that I was always younger. When I went to the city, I was always younger than my fellow students. And I graduated from high school when I was 17. And so that left me with a year basically before I needed to go to the army, because in Israel, military service is mandatory. There are ways to get out of it, but it is mandatory for the majority. And so I had a year, and during that year, I worked as an au pair, and I traveled by myself to South America, which had been a really important dream of mine since I was 10. I kind of fell in love randomly with the Inca
Hmm.
and really wanted to do the Machu Picchu trail. So I did that. And right after that, went into the army.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I took my spiritual journey to
Uh-huh.
Peru earlier this year, so I definitely want to talk more about that.
Let's talk
I,
more about that. That's a
that
beautiful, yeah,
Where
beautiful
did you
place.
start? Where did
The
you?
Machu Picchu Trail.
Hmm.
So typically I blended in La Paz in Bolivia
Hmm.
and then went through the islands, right? So the Lago Titicaca has the two islands, the Moon and the Sun
Hmm.
islands, where supposedly originally the originators of the Inca came from. And so I traveled there, and then I went through Peru all the way up to Machu Picchu.
Hmm.
Yeah,
And how long is
that's
that
what
trip?
it wasn't a very long trip. Let's see, maybe a couple of months, and because I did take stops in between, but I guess I spent the most time in Cusco,
Hmm.
and I loved Cusco. It was
Me too.
amazing,
It's an
and
incredible city.
it is an incredible city. And around there, I went to Machu Picchu, I went to Ollantaytambo, I went to a couple of other places, and it's maybe you should say something about your yes.
Maybe later.
Okay.
That was an interesting trip. I just want to hear a little bit more about you first. So what I know what sticks out to me the most about Peru trip. I don't know if people are ready to hear about that just yet. But what stuck out most to you?
Well, I guess there were many things that really were important about that trip for me,
Hmm.
and some of it relate to what we talked about, as in um, kind of finding your own, which I think is part of being resilient, right? And
Hmm.
so Here I was technically a minor still, but this is something I really wanted to do, and I worked hard to make it happen. So it was, in some ways, the very first time that, as an adult, for myself, I managed to really exercise my will in a big way. And it takes you to the edge of things, right? So
Hmm.
there were certainly scary moments in, waiting alone in a bus stop in a country I didn't know with very poor Spanish at the time. And you have to kind of, as a person, go through your head and say, what am I doing? Is this smart? Should I be doing this? What if something happened to me? And you have to sort of be there.
Yeah.
And I think these are the moments that you build yourself as a person, where you kind of find your limits, and you also test your limits, and then you know more about yourself, and you know more about the world, and others know more about who you are. And so I think it was a very clarifying journey for me on that end, which is aside from the fact that Peru is amazing, and there were so many brilliant things that the Inca as a culture had come up with, from the way they built to the way they lived to, just amazing to see. Um, and then finally, the unexpected pieces of any travel, right? So I coincidentally during the trip met a few people from Ecuador,
Hmm.
and we befriended. And so by the time I had made it to Ecuador, they were already seeking for me. They thought that I was going to cross a little bit earlier. And so there was a very surreal moment where, here I am, and I don't know, I just turned 18, I think, and maybe a day before or so. And I just crossed the border, and on a bus, they stop the bus, and there's a person with, a soldier with a big
Hmm.
gun coming and saying, what's your name? And he's looking at my documents, and he's taking me with him. And I'm like, oh, what just happened? um, and they didn't tell me anything. And I was sitting in the police station for a very long time, and nobody would talk to me. They just said somebody was looking for you, and I was like, okay, that's not good. But then my friends came in and said, oh, they found you. You're good. You're okay. And I went to their house. It was amazing. It was great. But again, these are the moments where you kind of live with yourself and you say, oh, I'm making adventures. This is
Yeah.
a good life.
Yeah, and a little bit
Yeah.
before the days when they could just shoot you a text, let you know they're looking for you.
That could still have
Yeah.
happened. And in that time, there was actually a big border strife
Hmm.
between Peru and Ecuador. So, and certainly there was even at that time, and still there are a lot of challenges around drugs and so forth. So between and how it's transported. So I mean, it could have gotten bad. I definitely didn't have any shortage of negative scenarios in my
Yeah.
head, but but it worked out really well.
Was that your first time really traveling or getting
I
outside of
traveled a
the?
lot
Hmm.
before. Um, but mostly either with my family or in more organized ways.
Hmm.
And this was certainly the first time I traveled by myself, right? So I had traveled before, uh, let's say with my family, or with a boyfriend or whatnot, but I hadn't like traveled by myself for such a long period of time. And actually, that opened up a different thing that I've done many years after that. I really realized how much I love understanding the world and culture and
Hmm.
different places and contexts where people reside. And so that's another thing that sort of opened up for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I understood that a lot more when I took my trip as well. That was it was my first time really traveling at all, but
Mhm.
it was my first time traveling out of the country. It was my first time
Mhm.
traveling alone,
Yeah.
in a place where I thought I spoke the language until I actually landed.
Yeah.
I was like, oh no, I have no clue what anyone is saying. Great. uh, yeah, and I don't know, it really made me cherish connecting with people
Mhm.
because I couldn't have any complex conversations with anyone out there that spoke Spanish. But even just a small connection, just looking to people for help because I felt like a child in some strange place.
Yeah.
And then just having someone help me, even if it's just showing me where the store is or something like that. I don't know. It really made me realize how much I cherish connecting with people. So,
Yeah, and you have that realization that is, on one hand, you realize how much, there's a universal understanding, right? So you know that even with the limited languages that you have, you get that sense that if you really needed somebody's help,
mm-hmm.
they, just by the sheer nature that they are human as you are, and they can experience many of the things that you would, that they would recognize that you're in pain or you're in trouble, or that with or without your words they'll get that you're thirsty or you're hungry or you're right. So
Yeah.
there is a kind of an equalizer there when you lose the language and you get that you can actually communicate
Yeah.
the basic needs very easily. But there's also that loss of realizing, oh, but I can't communicate all the other wonderful things that I have in my head
Yeah.
because really, my current vocabulary has 7 words, and that
Yeah.
that is not enough.
Luckily, right before
Yeah,
that trip, I had developed a habit of journaling, or
right.
else I actually really don't know what I would have done with all that stuff in my head. But I was able to at least tell it to my journal.
And that's a wonderful thing to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that actually reminds me of something else which we may or may not want to talk about. And that is that I think we have an inherent, as humans, we have an inherent need and want to connect
Hmm.
on a very intimate, small basis, but also societally, right? And we also have a need to express. Aside from the need to connect with another and be in relationship with another, we also have a true need to express ourselves. And when we talk about creativity, any kind of creativity, so it could be art, it could be, just communication, journaling, it could be making speeches, it could whatever. Um, it all comes from a very inherent need that we have to take what we create in our head that is so complicated and layered and so linked to meaning making
Hmm.
for who we are and what we understand and what we don't understand. And we get really stuck, I think, if we don't know how to bring that one out. And that's part of art therapy, and that's part of the ideas behind any kind of therapy, really. Um, but certainly any kind of creative therapy is the idea that we have all this wellness of understanding inside.
Hmm.
And if we can't share it, even if we have someone that really cares about us right next to us, we are ultimately really alone.
Yeah.
And there are fewer things that are more challenging for us as humans in this world than to feel like we're dealing with it all on our own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I completely agree. Uh, just because you said that, I want to skip forward a little bit. We've mentioned art therapy a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
I know before I met you, I had no clue what that was. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about art therapy?
Well, thank you, and thank you for asking it. The funny thing about art therapy is that most people haven't heard of it, and if they have, they've heard of it hopefully within a context where they actually could ask someone what it
Hmm.
was. Um, but there are also people who would come up with all kinds of ideas about what it is. I remember being once stuck in an elevator with somebody, and we talked about what I did, and I said in art therapy, and they said, "Oh, so you restore paintings?" I'm like, "That's a different kind." um, but no, I don't. I don't do
Right.
that. So
It's
art
not
therapy is
therapy
not
for the
is not
art.
no not not therapy for the art. Art therapy is really a modality of therapy or
Hmm.
a way of conducting therapy that focuses on art making. And the idea is that sometimes, although words are a lot, there is sometimes not enough. And there are other areas of knowing in our bodies, in our mind, that are not as easily tapped into as art would do. And that's not to say it can't be words per se. Poetry could do that, but it's
Hmm.
a different way of looking at the words, right? It's a more intuitive, more felt sense, more creative, essentially, and more expressive way of looking at what it is that you're experiencing and feeling. And for the most part, what art therapy does, specifically when somebody say they're an art therapist, they mean that they use plastic arts typically. So medias that you can form, you could draw, you could sculpt, you could make collages, you can do many other things um, to express how one feels and what's going on, and then to keep looking at that, really facing what has come up and what you might want to do with it. And there are many beautiful things that could come up that are very surprising in getting to know yourself and sometimes getting to know somebody else in your family, not just through the arguments that they already have prepared many times when you had conversations with
Hmm.
them, or even the conscious thoughts in one's head, but really coming to this place of realization that's so deep and so heartfelt.
So you say you use plastic arts more than anything. Is that because of that limitation of speech that you just mentioned before? Like maybe.
Oh no, so there are other fields that are related or
Hmm.
similar to art therapy, but are not typically considered art therapy. So there's fields that are called expressive arts or expressive art therapies that typically uh, also called a multimodal therapy, and so they kind of tap into dance and tap into poetry and tap into other things, but they don't have a specialization in any
Mm,
particular
okay.
media. Art therapy typically stays within the idea of the arts as in the plastic arts. And then you'll find people who literally are doing poetry therapy or just doing whatnot, drama therapy, and that's a different specialization. So you could either go to one of the specialized modes or do an expressive therapies where you kind of go between, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I actually don't know too much about therapy in general. How do you
What do you mean?
decide,
That's
or
what you're
how
doing here?
does
No.
trying to on myself?
Yeah.
Uh, so how do you decide, or how does one decide that art therapy is the way to go?
It's a good question. So there are many ways that people come to therapy to begin with, and any therapy, right?
Hmm.
And I would say they're typically either because the person themselves decide that they really could need some support, and the place that they got to is really stuck, is really not working, um, and or they come to it from a place where somebody in their lives, somebody close, or sometimes it's mandated, right? Depending on what has happened, decides, okay, this person really needs help in a different way because something in their lives is impacting themselves and others in ways that are not working. And I want to make that distinction, not because it's necessarily linked to the outcomes of therapy. It's not always, interestingly. But because I think at the beginning it sets up a very different expectation, right? So if you're coming a place of to a place where you're trying to work on yourself and work on other things because you really feel like you need it, it's a very different experience, yeah. And
Hmm.
you choose whether you want to go to whatever art therapy or verbal therapy or dance therapy or whatnot. It's very different than if your mother says, you know what, you're going to go to therapy, yeah, and you're going to go to therapy now, right? And I make the distinction because I feel one of the things that art and any creative therapy provides is a way to engage in digging deep and looking at what's going on in a way that is a lot less intrusive and at the same time very authentic and very real. Um, that doesn't have to like kind of bombard your defenses or your right, because it has a way to kind of go around to circumvent some of the challenges. So if a child comes to see me because their parents are like, this child needs therapy, right? um, if I only had verbal tools and I'd say, all right, let's talk about it, what would they say? I don't want to, right?
Hmm.
Or they won't say anything, or they'll say, a sliver of what actually is going on. But when I say, okay, here I have all these materials, do you want to do anything? Most times, most times, they will easily engage in something because there, first of all, there's choice, and there's fun in it, and there's play in it, and there's an invitation to just actively engage, and be yourself. And then the job of the art therapist would be to not um, to really pace with the client where they're at, right? So if there's a child who really, really doesn't want to talk about something, I could take the art and say, okay, so tell me about the problem that your mom said. We can see it right here, right? I already lost them, right? And now they're
Hmm.
never going to do art again with me because I didn't respect where they were and what they needed to do. But it's so easy with the art to just honor what came out and say, hey, look at that. What came up for you?
Hmm.
What is that? And again, 9 times out of 10, all we want in life is for somebody else to see us, to really truly see us and understand what's going on with us
Right.
and be there. And you can use your own words if you want. And so it's not like there aren't words in art therapy, but they're not the only tool.
And
Yeah.
so you're using the art more as a way to break down the barrier to being open, or do you see this art and actually make observations and predictions from it, or is it a mixture?
And some of it to make internal changes. So it
Hmm.
works on all and in so many ways, right? So first of all, the art by itself has, I really believe, a therapeutic healing capacity. Just as you found journaling to be a place where you could contain and express,
Mm-hmm.
that's again an inherent aspect of art, right? So if somebody's coming in and they're very, very anxious, let's say, just sitting down and tearing papers, right? Or making something really messy, or making something that's very, very, very accurate, yeah, very precise. All of these are ways to regulate ourselves, right? To contain our anxiety, to feel better about things, and that can be done really intuitively with the art. So I can direct that if I see that a child is completely lost. But for the most part, again, 9 times out of 10, we have an internal sense of what would be good for us, and giving the choices and giving the space to do it. People will kind of, as plants would sort of grow towards the light. I really believe people, grow towards healing. They tend to move towards the places where they need to go. So your job mostly will be to provide that safe space where people can really do that for themselves. And so some of it really would allow to then make articulated verbal meaning. But
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's more about symbolic work, right? So, if you have somebody who really right now feels really broken or ugly, or in a place where they don't know where to go, and they create something that either reflects that internal feelings and then allows them to look at it and maybe alter it, maybe make it better, right? There is an experience there, and the experience is of possibility and of healing. Even if it's not yet them, there's a possibility there of something else happening. And if they're able to create something that they're satisfied with, there's also an inherent sense of pleasure and self-esteem, right? And self-enhancement. When somebody else witnesses that, then you also have a sense of connection and validation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are many things that happen in the room even without saying anything. And then the art has a wonderful aspect as well in having a lasting product, right? So you see it right now, and right now you feel about it a certain way, and then you go home for a week and you come back and here it is again. And you could choose to continue to work on it, or you can say, yeah, this week, yeah, I'm not at all interested in that anymore, I'm over it.
Yeah.
But something else came up and here's what I want to do.
And I was just thinking right now, we keep talking about art and mentioned creativity a couple of times.
Mm-hmm.
I I felt like as a kid, I don't feel like I did. I drew a lot. I wrote a lot of fiction. I
Mm-hmm.
had a stronger imagination. It felt like I did,
Yeah.
and something happened along the way where I just started really, really suppressing that to the point where I, even though I kind of knew internally that journaling or drawing or something, it's something that I would like to do. I I don't know exactly where I felt the pressure from, whether it's from society or my peers or just the kinds of people that I looked up to. I just felt like to create was a waste of time. And not just to create, but I felt like creating art was a waste of time and
Yeah.
something that only very few people could do.
Yeah.
But now that I've started to actually write a little bit more and start to get back to those things that I valued as a child, I see that not creativity isn't just in making a piece of art
Yeah.
or writing a sculpture or a painting or anything. Creativity is existence.
Mm-hmm.
You have to create pretty much every minute of your life. And I don't know, I would love to be able to do something to change
Yeah.
our definition of creativity and the kind of negative connotation with it that comes with it.
It's interesting because in the 30s and the 50s, there were a lot of conversations in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
specifically. I'm thinking of John Dewey, for example, who's a very famous philosopher, about that exact thing, about why is it that we're relegating creativity only to a select few, and we say, you're only designated as an artist if you can create a masterpiece, and that masterpiece goes to the museum. Otherwise, really, you're not making art. You're just whatever, making images or whatnot. Um, and there were also at the time a lot of research was happening in psychology about divergent thinking, and how we think in different ways, in creative ways, not just getting from point A to point B, but really understanding that when we can come up with different solutions, right, the divergent thinking to one problem, in fact, we have a higher likelihood of solving that problem,
Mm-hmm.
right, and things of that nature. Um, And somehow it went by the wayside, and there were a lot of pressures. I think there still are a lot of pressures, which you named some of them, to specialize. Right. So in general, what we do for kids is we start off with basically telling them you can do anything, and somewhere I would say around, yeah, I mean it starts early for some, but I would say depending on your family and societal challenges, certainly in elementary school, you get more and more of the sense of, oh, you can do that, but you can't do that. You're really good at this, but this, yeah, don't do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and some of it happens an individual basis based on what it is that you do and like, but some of it is really very societal and gendered, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would imagine in your particular case that you were relegated towards sports because here you were strong and you were able to do this and this was really great and you're a man and so here's something that you could be good at and that fits our gender norm.
Yeah.
Um, and we do that a lot. We do that a lot when it comes to art. We do that a lot when it comes to any profession, really, if you think about it. And unfortunately, we do it in a way that I think is very harmful for everybody, right? Because it does mean that for men specifically, as a society, this is not on an individual basis, but for men specifically, we make it very hard to stay in touch with feelings, the range of feelings that one would have, and see them as healthy and good and expressible and worthy. And we definitely cap the ability of most men to express themselves in creative ways that are not fitting what we call masculine.
Mm-hmm.
And we do the same for women. We say, that doesn't look really that beautiful or feminine, or maybe you could do that, or oh, you were probably good at math, but you're really good with your English, right? And even though, really, if you look at statistics, women, girls do better than boys in math early on, but right in the middle of elementary school, it starts shifting.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's clearly not an intellectual challenge, it's a societal challenge that we have. And probably the worst problem is that we are such a gendered society that we make people feel like they need to fit a mold of either a boy or a girl, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can't be something in the middle. There is a little bit more leniency for what we call tomboys, right? So girls who are a little bit leaning that way because boys is still the higher status, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's okay to go that way, but it wouldn't be okay for a boy to be a little bit more feminine, right? So these pressures have been around for a while. They still are there, and together with the pressure that we have that I think is coming really from capitalism about specializations. Like you need to find a profession, you need to find a good profession, you need to be early age, right?
Mm-hmm.
So don't choose art because what will you do with art? And there's less pressure for women because we are not necessarily seen as the breadwinners, which again is a problem for both men and women.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of goes back to what I was saying about like we're all creative. Like, the fact that we even make a distinction between playing sports and making a painting. Like even if you're playing sports, you're being creative
Yes.
to play sports. So I don't even know where the distinction really comes from. I guess gender, as you
Yeah.
say, but
Yeah.
it's I don't know. It seems so weird to me when it was something that was so normal for the other 26 years of my life.
Yes.
Um,
No, it's definitely some of it is unfortunately a way that we sustain the system that we currently have,
mhm,
right? So the thing about systems is that they can change, but they change very, very slowly,
mhm,
and there are a lot of pressures to maintain them. And there's some comfort for all of us to stay in a system that we know. So there's always kind of this push and pull. To what degree are we willing to do something different and really allow for things that don't meet the mold? Yeah, to be there, to be present, to see them as valuable. And I come from a different society that has its own, of course, sets of challenges and benefits. But I would say it was only really where I got to the U.S. Personally, where I saw that there was things that were put as synonymous that in my head, were not synonymous, like different and bad. Were not things that in my upbringing were seen as synonymous at all. There was more of a space for difference as being a good thing.
mhm,
Um, and small things like cultural things like here when you say I'm going to go party, you mean I'm going to go drink. That's not existent in other culture. And I name this because We don't even think of these things unless we step out of the culture or the context in which we reside. And then we're able to say, oh, wait, they don't mean that. They mean that. Oh, it doesn't have to be. That by default is really not something that has to be that way. So, one of the things that I hope we're doing here in talking about this is just to have people again revisit those spaces within themselves where they say, oh, it's not 100% coincidental that I got to this place where I am, the profession where I am to do what I'm doing. But there is a choice there. There really is still a choice of what of that do I want to maintain and what of that do I want to change,
Mhm.
yeah, at any given point.
Yeah, and what was really powerful to me was to understand that I didn't have to pick something in particular that I wasn't used to doing to make or to grow leaps and bounds. It was really just picking anything. Like
Yeah.
there's like you don't have to go and mold a sculpture. You don't have to go and travel to Peru. Just do something that you're not used to, or even have a conversation with someone you wouldn't normally talk to.
It's true. But sometimes, interestingly, sometimes to get to these places and realizations, you have had to push yourself outside of the comfort zone,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because if you don't stretch yourself out of the comfort zone, you don't really you don't really have those understandings. You don't really have that insight because you haven't tried it.
Yeah, definitely. And I was actually just talking about this with my dad today. I feel like a great place to get used to pushing yourself outside of that comfort zone is in the gym.
Mm.
And that's another thing that has a weird stigma to it. Like people that go to the gym are meatheads and they're not intelligent. So it kind of discourages people that have that more creative. Well, trying to quote, knocked on the mic, have that more creative focus to not take care of their bodies or not to go and see what you can learn by pushing yourself physically.
And I think this is still the same strange philosophy that we have about specialization,
Mm-hmm.
right? As if in order to be an intellectual, you need to do this, and in
Mm-hmm.
order to be a creative, you need to do that. And some of it is systemically enhanced, right? So in high school, if you're really able intellectually, for the most part, you're going to be pushed into those classes, the AP classes, and the classes where you're doing really well, right? Academically. And if you're not so good at that, well, here are the remedials, and you could do this, this, or that. And some of that includes art and includes sports,
Mm-hmm.
right? And actually, not because they require anything less, but because they don't necessarily require the other piece
Yeah.
necessarily, right? And so, interestingly, again, it supports kind of a stigma that is not true, obviously, but is really sustained by the system.
The weird thing is, in a lot of areas, I do have some benefit from specializing.
Hmm.
But I still resisted at like every turn. Like I understand that there's benefit to trying a bunch of different things as well.
Yeah.
Benefits that you can't ever really know until you try them. But also by specializing and diving deep into something, I feel like you can learn so much about the world around you.
Oh,
And it's like,
100%. And thank you for bringing that up because my intention is not to say that we don't want to specialize. We
mm-hmm,
want to be able to know something deeply and really be very good at something. And you can't do it if you don't have a sustained commitment. Even when we thought about creativity, typically we think about divergent thinking. We also think of convergent thinking. So convergent thinking really being you do need to know that 1 + 1 is 2
mm-hmm,
and 3 + 3 is 6. And that's not going to change. And it's not about you being creative and saying, no, I think actually in my world 3 + 3 is 7. That's not going to help you because there are some times where you really need convergent thinking, going from point A to point B in a linear direction, and there is an actual right and wrong answer. But there are also other times in life where that's not going to be very useful to you and where you have more than one solution. So the fact that we teach students generally to really have more convergence and focus and really understand linearly to answer right to the test. And in the 4 answers, there's one right answer, and you have to choose the right or the most right answer. Sometimes is good, but sometimes is really, really restricts their ability to come up with other solutions and be more flexible and be more adaptive and be more fluid and be able to elaborate on something that already exists. Because if that already exists, then hey, I have nothing else to do, right?
yeah. And instead of even just calling it a solution, I think it restricts your ability to see different paths in life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think where the distinction is coming in for me, or where I've found that I can specialize, is that it's great to go out and try a bunch of different things because
Hmm.
it teaches me what's really important to me, and
Right,
then I can choose what to specialize in.
right.
Whereas before, I just felt like I was on some
A
locked in
track.
track.
And that's the other thing, right? You want to, a lot of things in life, I think, are um, dialectic, right? So you want to do this, but you also want to do that, right? So,
Hmm.
so you want to specialize and you want to have a sense of focus and want to have a sense of purpose and you don't want to aimlessly kind of go about your journey. And at the same time, you don't want to be afraid of trying out new things and sometimes moving away from your path to see what's out there and in the other side of the forest, and sometimes to learn of whether there's a better path for you than the one you've taken, but also just to get a sense of what other paths are there and where are other people walking. Because at the end of the day, we're not alone in this journey, right? And there are other people in the journey that are also trying to get to similar places and they're coming from a different direction. And unless you know their road, you're not going to meet, right? So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So I now to go way back to the beginning. So you finish up your trip to Peru, and then I
Oh,
want to
that's
know.
good.
I want to know how you got to where you are today.
All right. You want the censored version or no? Uh,
Uncensored, please.
let's see. So the easy censored version is, and then we'll go to the more interesting one. Is that I after my military service, which was in the Air Force, and worked as an instructor. So I one of the things that I learned there, and I constantly learn, is that any step of the way, whether you choose it or not, you learn something about yourself that then helps you know something. Another stone for your treasure chest that you then could use as a
Mm-hmm.
tool and as a memory, yeah, stone for later. So that was a good reminder for me that I actually could teach, that I could teach, and that I could direct. I at some point was responsible for a group of soldiers, and so it was important for me to know that about myself because again, without trying, I wouldn't have known, right, necessarily that I have that capacity to do that, and I sort of tacked it away. And then I started to study psychology for my undergrad in Israel, in Haifa, which is a beautiful city. Has a hill, the Carmel Hill, next to the ocean, and um, I during my first year. Yeah, during my first year of psychology, I went to, as part of a delegation called Shalom Salam. It was just after the Oslo Agreement, to Norway for about 2 months. It was a Palestinian Israeli delegation, and the idea was to take a group of people, students, so young adults, to form some kind of a grassroots movement, which clearly happened and hasn't happened since. But and we were six. Six boys, six girls, six Palestinians, six Israelis, and we were sort of thrust together to this summer school in Oslo, in Norway, and we took a peace research course together. And again, that was really influential for me in many ways. First of all, it was important for me to be in that in an international environment as a whole, and um, Jewish, Arab, Israeli, Palestinians dialogue have always been actually part of my life. My dad's a peace activist. I've been actually involved in some programs earlier on, both as a child and then as an adolescent. But this was again the first time that as an adult I got to sort of find my place within that. Um, and it was challenging, and challenging in ways that I had expected and didn't expect, right? And so this is where the personal and politics kind of come together, and you have to really understand how, as a human, you bring yourself whole and you bring yourself individually, but you're also always carrying what you know
Mm-hmm.
from your culture and from your society, and you also understand the political pressures in the way that they impact you directly. You don't always see clearly what it does for somebody else, right? Unless you have more of a dialogue with them. How would you know? Again, that knowing the other path. Because you can't really be in their shoes. You can't really sit in their seat. You don't really understand that unless you really pay attention. And that opens your mind to say, oh, okay, if I enter that room from that direction and not this direction, that does look different, you know? And that propels a sense of empathy for another. And again, this was instructional for me in many ways. It was instructional on a political sense, but also in a personal sense, in understanding and valuing how much we really do have to learn about ourselves and about others, and how dialogue can really foster that. Um, and I think following that experience, I'd come back to Israel. We had done a couple of other things, and I was just completing my bachelor's when the Second Intifada broke. And now I had friends on both sides of the borders, right? In the Palestinian authorities and in Israel. And not just acquaintances and not just news in the media, but now I actually was concerned about what was now happening in Ramallah or, in El Aruf or wherever. And I was also concerned about the fact that my family and my friends around me were, uh, we're constantly hearing about more bombings and things happening, and I'm driving to work and there's a blockade, and it's a blockade because there was a bombing, and so you kind of try to manage, okay, this crazy world. And in that moment, specifically in time for me, it really felt like such a heartbreak. It felt like something I couldn't recover from. I just lost hope in uh, whether we could actually recover the society together. It was really so depressing to see everybody that you care about so much and see the gaps between how people operate and how we keep missing each other, right? So it's sort of like looking at two people that really in your mind would have been able to come together, but there's constantly this, weaving in and out and not actually coming to meet and make things better. And and at that time I was accepted here for a PhD, and so I decided to do that. And and initially, I actually got into a psychology PhD here, and now it's called Alliant University. It used to be called California School of Professional Psychology. And here is how you meet other cultures. Sometimes thrust into knowing other cultures. So I took myself and moved myself here with the understanding that I had financial aid. Now, in Israel, financial aid means scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
Now, financial aid here means something completely different for the most part. And I looked at
Like
these
aid.
forms. Yeah, and I looked at these forms and I was like, you must be kidding me. I'm not taking $100,000 in loans. No, no,
Mm-hmm.
I can't do that because, at least in my mind at that time, I was going back to Israel. And I was like, that's not happening. Can't do it. And so, literally a week after I arrived here, I dropped out. And then it took me a few years to sort of figure out what I'm doing. Now, before that, I'll trace back while I was in my bachelor's, I also started working in a psychiatric hospital in Haifa. I worked with teens specifically in what we call a partial hospitalization, which means that the kids were there maybe between around school hours, so probably between, I'd say, 9 and 2 or 3 p.m. And they had school there, but they also received therapeutic support of many kinds. And these were typically kids who had such severe symptoms that they had either ended up in psychiatric hospitalization, because of suicidality or homicidality or other issues, psychotic breaks. Um, or they were getting so the situation, they hadn't made it completely to a psychiatric hospital, but they couldn't just go to uh, a regular school. Uh, and that was really my first introduction to mental health in a big way. And luckily for me, in that particular facility, they had an art therapist and a dance therapist and a music therapist and a recreational therapist, as well as verbal therapist, regular
Mm-hmm.
therapist. And as soon as I learned about art therapy, I thought, that I want to do that. This makes sense to me
Yeah.
because all these years here I've been using my art and writing, and I understand that. I can be with other people doing art, looking at what's coming up for them in that way. And so when initially I thought I'd get my PhD in psych first and then add the art therapy on top. But when I skipped that plan, I basically went the other route. And it took me some time here to get um, my art courses in order, because you do need, we have requirements that you have to do to get into an art therapy program. So I did that for about a year and a half. And then I entered the program that I now teach in,
Yeah.
Loyola Marymount University's Marital Family Therapy Art Therapy program. And that was a wonderful experience. And soon after that, I continued into my PhD in Florida State University, where at the time they had the only or one of the only art therapy doctorates, which was under an art education kind of umbrella, and that was really fabulous. And then I came back here, and I came back here originally to teach some of the courses, and ended up staying. So that's it.
Awesome. I just out of curiosity, what kind of requirements do you have to?
So I should say that probably is I should say that we have a really good website that anybody who's interested in our requirements really should check, because there are many of them. So there are, in order to be an art therapist, you really have prerequisites that are coming from psychology as well as art, and these are mandatory classes. We have to take those before the actual degree, because it's a very packed degree as it is. It's very intense. And we have to begin with an understanding that you already have some solid base in how you understand both psychology and art, and that you can use art. So another requirement would be an art portfolio, and another requirement that we have is a biographical narrative, right? Because we want to see how you're able to look at your life, at yourself, and to what extent are you able to have an understanding about you and your environment. And so there are many different pieces to this. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, again, I've talked to you 100 times, and I still didn't know too much about art therapy, but it's great. I didn't know there were such intense requirements either, but it makes sense. You should probably use art in your life if you're gonna try to help.
Yes, or at least have a really good sense of what it does,
Yeah.
and a range of materials, right? Because the other thing is, you might be a fantastic photographer and you only do photography, but now you have a client who's not interested in photography. Now what? Right? So you have to have a way of really offering a plethora of tools.
Yeah. So becoming an therapist really opens up the way to actually be able to try out a bunch of different things in divergent thought.
Exactly. So
Awesome.
so you could experiment, or you could specialize, right? That could certainly be your choice as a client, and you should have that choice.
Sounds like you found your calling then.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. So I won't keep you for too much longer. Any closing thoughts?
No, first of all, I'm really honored to be doing this, and I love our conversations regardless.
Yeah.
I really appreciate them, and they bring me back to life. And I think sometimes it's a good reminder that it's only when we are in dialogue that sometimes new things sort of come to place. So even if these are, for the most part, ideas that I've had in my head, having conversation with you and having a thought of, okay, how is that, am I making myself articulated or clear, that helps me bring that back to consciousness and say, oh, this is really an important part of my life. So I want to thank you for helping me kind of remember and be aware.
I'm glad I could be of help, even though I had no clue that I was doing that.
See,
Cool.
you should add therapy with that buff nerd under your.
Yeah. So where should people go if they want to find out more about art therapy, or they want to find more about
Yeah,
your work?
so we do really have a good website. So if you go to Loyola Marymount University Art Therapy, Marital and Family Therapy Department, you'll find everything. We do have a workshop once a year that's open to the public, where people could come and actually have an experiential, so they have a sense of what does it feel like, not to do art therapy per se, but to engage in art in a therapeutic way, and to have some presentations of art therapy work. So maybe that's the best way, I think, other than actually engaging in art therapy, which is another good way to learn more about art therapy, is to really see some work or read about some case studies and work that's been done. And Helen B. Langerton, who she was the founder of the department, and a big person in art therapy world in the West Coast, one of the first. She wrote several books. So if anybody's interested, Helen Langerton's a good name. Deborah Linish had written a few really good books. She was the chair of the department for a very, very long time. And we have, my work is really, initially was about creativity and resilience in New Orleans after Katrina. And later on, we actually did a replication in Chile. So again, if somebody's interested more in the broader term of creativity and resilience and kind of a cross-cultural perspective, they could go there too.
Cool. Well, I'll connect with you afterwards and put all this stuff into some notes so
Yep.
people can find it easily. And again, I want to thank you for donating some of your time to come and have a conversation today. And you guys can find me at buffnerdla.com or at Terrence Davey on Instagram. Thank you.